Dear students, I hope that you are all well and safe. First of all, I would like to apologize for the delay in uploading this lecture to you. I really did send it to the faculty a long time ago. However, I was lately notified that they couldn't upload it to you because of certain problems concerning the sound. They couldn't fix it, so they asked me to record it once again, which I am doing now. And I really hope that it works this time because it's really very, very tough. Well, let's start the lecture. Last time we met, I wanted you and asked you to read very well and study the 4 theories we discussed in the lecture, and to prepare yourselves to answer a certain question, which is, which of the 4 theories is more relevant or more important in studying international relations, phenomena and issues? I hope you did try. So, as we couldn't meet after our last lecture, I will try to discuss with you how can we answer this question. I assume that some of you who tried to answer the question said that it is liberalism and new liberalism are the most important theories to discuss international relations. Why? Because you like them. Why? Because their advocates talked about cooperation and coordination between states, and they did not like wars. However, I'm sorry to say that if you answered like this is not correct. It is not correct. Why? Because it is not a scientific answer. It is not an objective answer. It is an evaluation built on your values and your beliefs. You like them, but this means that you answered them in what we call value judgment. You evaluated them according to your judgment, which is not objective and not scientific. So I will help you answer the question. First, we can say, for example, that IR is very complicated phenomena and that it cannot be reduced to one theory only, meaning that we cannot explain international relations using one theory only. Second, we can say that each of the theories developed and appeared in certain era and in certain circumstances in the international system. For example, liberalism was popular and appeared after the First World War because of the problems and destructions of the war, and the advocates of liberalism discussed wars and how to avoid wars, what are the causes of wars, and put their program of reform. Then the Second World War took place, and it proved the idealistic characteristic of liberalism, and that it was not enough to discuss international relations. So realism appeared to discuss conflicts between international actors and was popular at the time of the following the Second World War, especially during the Cold War, the conflict between United States and the Soviet Union. Then followed the new realism, which was considered to be more scientific than realism. Then followed the the developments in the 1980s and 1990s, and the cooperation between the countries, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union. So neoliberalism started to develop to discuss cooperation and integration between states. Then you can summarize the advantages and limitations of each of the four theories. And then we conclude by saying that it is the topic you are discussing or doing research on is the major variable that will determine which of the theories you can depend on. If you are discussing conflicts, then which theory will be more relevant to discuss conflicts? It is realism. If you are discussing cooperation, then it is new liberalism. Sorry. Now we move to the topic of our lecture, which is behavioralism. We will discuss behavioralism in 3 points. Origin of behavioralism, meaning when and why did it start. Second, main characteristics of behavioralism. And third, evaluation of behavioralism. First, origin of behavioralism. When and why did it start? Behavioralism started in the late 60s and early 70s of the 20th century as a counter-reaction to what behavioralists called the traditional way of studying international relations. Advocates of behavioralism criticized the four theories we studied as being not scientific. They said that they were just abstract generalization and that they did not depend on scientific methodology. They rather depended on certain subjective beliefs and trying to select facts or cases that would fit to prove such pre-existing beliefs. So behavioralism is better described as a methodology rather than a theoretical perspectives. Behavioralism does not provide us with a theory. That is why it is called, or rather be called, methodology than a theoretical perspective, because it does not provide us with a theory. It is rather a methodology or a way of studying international relations in a scientific way. In other words, it is an application of scientific methods to the study of the phenomena and issues of IR. It is called behavioralism because its advocates admired the achievements of behavioral sciences, mainly psychology and sociology, in studying their phenomena in a scientific way. It is known that scientists in psychology and sociology had their doubts about the traditional approaches used in previous studies and wanted to use scientific approaches used in science in their studies. So we can say that behavioralists generally are skeptical about the traditional way of studies in social sciences in general as being abstract generalizations, and they admired the scientific approaches used in science. The famous names of advocates in behavioralism in political science in general and in international relations in particular are David Easton and David Singer. Second, main characteristics of behavioralism. There are 5 main characteristics of behavioralism. 1. Behavioralism emphasizes on using the scientific approach to the study of the phenomena in international relations. As you already know from our previous lectures, scientific approach includes, first of all, making or putting assumptions. Second, identifying the variables of the phenomena you are studying. Then testing the assumptions. Then trying to make correlations between the variables. And finally, trying to reach generalizations and rules that would apply across time and place. We can mention here some examples for correlations that we can or researchers can do concerning making correlations between variables, between independent variables and dependent variables in international relations. For example, we can make a correlation between military expenditure as an independent variable and the probability of wars as a dependent variable, meaning what is the effect of increase in military expenditure in some states and the probability of wars. Here we have military expenditure as an independent variable and wars as a dependent variable. So we can make a correlation between both, meaning we want to see if there is a correlation between the increase in military expenditure in states and the probability of going to war. Here, according to the behavioral approach, we can start collecting data about these 2 variables in all countries in the world or in a certain or specific region, say the Middle East, for example, for a long period of time, meaning we collect data about the 2 variables, military expenditure and the wars that took place in the whole world or in a certain region. Say, and this would be for a long period of time, say from 1950 to 1990 or 1995 or 1997, for example. We collect data about the variables in all countries or in a certain region. Data about military expenditure and data about the wars that took place between the countries in this region or in the whole world. And then we make a correlation between the 2 variables with the help of statisticians to conclude, for example, that the result of the correlation is 70% or 60% or 80%, meaning that there is a probability of 70% that the increase in military expenditure will lead to wars. Another example, we can make correlation between political system and wars, meaning we can collect data about political systems in many countries in the whole world or in a certain region, differentiating between democracies and dictatorships. and this will be the independent variable. And we can collect data about wars that took place between the states in this region or in the whole world during a long period of time also. Also, we can make correlation between economic assistance countries receive and the probabilities of wars or conflicts. Also, the level of economic development and wars, and so on and so forth. Building or making correlations between variables. 2. This approach depends on verifiable knowledge and data, meaning knowledge and data that can be proved. It also depends on testable evidence and not subjective beliefs or impressions. As we mentioned before, behavioralists criticized the traditional ways used by the theories you studied as having pre-existing beliefs and trying to select facts and cases to fit or to prove such beliefs. 3. This approach uses new tools and new methods in their studies and in their analysis. This includes quantitative analysis, and also they depend on statistics and statisticians to make the correlations, and also using computers to store the data they collect and to make the correlations between the variables. Here we can add also that they create and depend on data banks that include data on the variables they study. For example, data on assistance, data on wars, data on levels of dependency and interdependence, degree of interdependence between states, and also data about levels of economic development, and so on and so forth. 4. This approach depends on comparative and cross-national analysis and not case studies of a particular country in a particular time, meaning that they collect data about the variables they study in all countries of the whole world or all countries in a certain region, and also for a long period of time, say from 1948 to 1960, or from 1950 to 1990, or whatever. So they are not interested in case studies of relations between two or more countries. 5. This approach, or the behavioralists, can build models, and sometimes very complicated models that might include more than one independent variable and a dependent variable, meaning they can build models combining levels of interdependence between states, type of political system, levels of the economic development, economic assistance to countries, degree of interdependence between countries, as all of these as independent variables, and dependent variables such as wars and peace relations between states in the international system. And they can make correlations between those variables. Evaluation of behavioralism. As we mentioned, this approach was popular in the late 60s and early 70s of the 19th century. And it is still popular among some of the political scientists and scientists in international relations. It is interesting to do research making correlations and quantitative analysis. You yourselves can try to make such correlations. It is really interesting. However, this approach has some limitations to the extent that some of its advocates criticized their approach. First of all, or the first limitation of this approach is the preoccupation of behavioralists with their methods and with building models and making correlations and quantitative analysis at the expense of addressing the problems and issues in international relations. So it is said that they lost the sense of theory, meaning that they do not build theories for us. They do not make analysis to explain the relations between wars and poverty, for example, and the level of economic development. And they do not give us explanations. Another limitation is that behavioralists ignore the needs of policymakers. What do policymakers need? Policymakers need advice. They need advice concerning many issues related to international relations. For example, they need advice about what are the national interests of their countries. What are the threats for this for these national interests? Where do they come from? How to deal with such threats? What are the most important policies that they would pursue to promote their national interests? For example, in the case of Egypt, what are the national interests of our country? Where do the threats come from? Do they come from Israel, from Ethiopia, from Iran, from Turkey, which is the most important source of threat to us? They do not give the policymaker such advice. They do not evaluate or give him or give the policy maker what are the best policies to deal with such threats. And for example, also they do not give advice about economic assistance or military assistance that we receive. Are they good or bad? What are the implications of getting assistance from other countries? 3, this approach is very costly. It needs time and it needs a lot of resources to make research using behavioral approach. You need a group of researchers to work with you to collect data and to make put them or store them or store them in data banks. You need the help of statisticians to make correlations. So it is too costly and it needs a lot of time. 4, this approach relies on what we call past patterns of behavior. It depends on data from the past in a certain period of time that might not be relevant to the issues we face at present or in the future, meaning that they make correlations about arms race and probabilities of war during the period from 1960 to the year 2000, for example. That increase in military expenditure has an effect on the probability of war, but they do not tell us, or we cannot use this correlation in trying to explain relations between countries at present. Will war take place between the Arabs and Israelis in the near future, between Iran and its neighbors in the near future? They do not tell us this. Their correlations are correlations of the past, of correlations between the two variables. 5. This approach neglects very important ethical and social issues, such as poverty, hunger, environmental issues. These issues are very important, but they cannot be studied in a quantitative way. Also, number 6, human behavior, as you all know, is unique. It cannot be predicted, and it is very difficult to be quantified. It is difficult to be translated into numbers. However, we can use this approach to learn traces or to find trends and tendencies in the development of some issues. To say, for example, that there is a tendency that conflict will occur if there is an arms race. So we can conclude by saying that this approach is a methodology, not a theory. It provides us with tendencies of the development of certain issues.